or in short, the diversity of capitalist practices across time and space. In a paradoxical sense, we designed this colloquium to avoid what the feminist geographers Gibbs and Graham call capital centrism, in that capital activity is taken as the model for all economic behavior or writ large human activity. Anthropology has looked at the consequences of capitalism for the last several decades, but often leaves the term itself under-theorized, leaving it as a monolithic black box. At the same time, the domain of what we consider to be economic has expanded, both in the academy and in the public sphere, as books like Freakonomics fly off the shelves. We hope this colloquium will capture the energy of a recent turn against this trend, to re-inject the social and the cultural into the economic. On Mondays over the next year, we've invited 21 speakers that look at capitalism, to take a phrase from our first speaker's most recent written work, to look at how capitalism is generative, how it is both generated and what it generates. This opens up new spaces of inquiry, from ethnographic looks at corporations in Saudi Arabia to oil rigs off the West African coast. In sum, anthropology is ideally suited for this task, as it is often at its strongest when it's looking, complicating, and problematizing the relationship between the global and the local. There's no greater force, arguably over the past 500 years, than the capitalist world economy. But of course, these global forces are made in local contingencies, histories, and political and social relations. Anthropologists thrive in these local contingencies, and I hope you will join us over the next year on Mondays to hear some good talks. And with that, I'll introduce Naomi Zucker.
Hi, everyone. So we're extremely fortunate to open this year's Colloquium series with today's talk by Dr. Hannah Appel. Dr. Appel is Assistant Professor in the Department of Anthropology and Global Studies at UCLA. She earned her PhD from Stanford and has held postdoctoral fellowships at the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia and in Natural Resource Economics at UC Berkeley. She is editor with Akhil Gupta and our own Akhil Anand of The Promise of Infrastructure, and is completing her manuscript, Oil and the Illicit Life of Capitalism in Equatorial Guinea. Dr. Appel's work speaks to critical questions about infrastructure, corporations, finance, and the economic imagination, bringing ethnographic perspectives to bear on how capitalism is made to work on the ground. Please join me in offering our very warmest welcome to Dr. Hannah Appel.
So much. It's great to be here and to benefit from the momentum of the first one of the year. I feel like if I were last, this room would look a lot different. So it's really nice to see everybody's face, and I want to thank Professors Grace Urban and Douglas Smith for the invitation and for conceiving of this fabulous year-long trajectory. You guys are in for a treat. I also want to thank Naomi for just making this all so smooth, and also Laura Fields for her administrative expertise. I think we maybe exchanged all of one email, and I had a flight, and I had everything, so it was wonderful. Thank you to all of you. Dawn in Bata, Equatorial Guinea's second city. At 6 a.m., I stood outside the headquarters of a large US-based oil company with a small group of others, a Spanish woman, a man from Louisiana, and 2 Equato-Guinean men waiting to go offshore by helicopter. We stood quietly and not quite together, separated by the early hour, and by not quite knowing if we were all there for the same purpose. Eventually, an Equato-Guinean driver pulled up in a company bus. As we boarded, he requested our identification passes to electronically register each of our exits from the compound, and then drove us to the company's private wing of the Bata airport. After an airport worker searched our bags, we sat in a small room to watch a safety video on the importance of in-flight protective equipment and what to do if our helicopter were to catch fire in midair. At liftoff, the helicopter rose effortlessly, and the city of Bata spread out beneath us. Further from shore, looking back, the Intem River marked the edge of the continent. After a while, scenery faded into the calm of the open ocean seen from above and the gently vibrating lull of the helicopter through noise-canceling headphones. About 20 minutes after takeoff, a bright flame appeared in the distance, attached to a still indistinct industrial atoll, a rig. Just as the rig came into view, the helicopter banked left, and we landed briefly on what looked to me like an aircraft carrier, leaving the Spanish woman on what was in fact a floating production, storage, and offloading vessel. With the production rig visible some hundreds of yards away across the water, the FPSO was animated by its own large flare, burning the crude's gaseous byproducts. Both the rig and this vast, self-propelling, ship-like structure floated above a field, producing 100,000 barrels of crude oil per day. Every 10 days, a tanker would pull alongside the FPSO and leave with 1 million barrels of oil. From subsea hydrocarbon deposit to the rig, to the FPSO, to the tanker, to market, the production chain of Equatorial Guinea's oil was clearest to me far off the country's shores. Capitalism is not a context. It is a project. The material I want to present today draws from a forthcoming book that offers an ethnographic account of the daily life of capitalism. It is both an account of a specific capitalist project, U.S. oil companies working off the shores of Equatorial Guinea, and an exploration of more general forms and processes, the offshore, contracts, infrastructures, something called the economy, that facilitate diverse capitalist practices around the world. Contracts, economic theory, the economy, each of these is both a condition of possibility for contemporary capitalism and an ongoing entanglement with a raced and gendered histories of colonialism, empire, and white supremacy, out of which capitalism and liberalism emerged. Indeed, I found liberalism in the field. Specifically, the ways oil company management, and to a lesser extent Equatorial state actors, used contracts, economic theory, and market rationality, not only as powerful tools in and of themselves, but also as a felicitous moral architecture through which to sanction capitalist practices. Thus, part of the daily life of capitalism was the relationship between the liberal modernity claimed by US oil companies and the racialized global inequality that radically delimits the ways in which Equatorial Guinea and other post-colonial African countries might engage with multinational corporations. We have learned from the Black radical tradition, settler colonialism, post-colonial and feminist traditions that racism, misogyny, and dispossession are not exceptions to liberalism, but constitutive of it. So too, I argue, must we shift our critical understanding of capitalism from one in which profit-oriented markets merely deepen or respond to various forms of inequality, to one in which markets are made by that inequality. Global markets, the oil market chief among them, do not merely exacerbate post-colonial disparities. They are constituted by them. In Equatorial Guinea and around the world, accreted histories of racialized disparity proxy for rational, neutral market behavior, the rules of the economy. And in an effort to show this today, I'll draw from two book chapters. One on the subcontracts that people the transnational oil industry, and a second on domestic life in the segregated residential enclaves of US oil firms in Equatorial Guinea. The contract form is an ethnographic thread that weaves its way through several book chapters, today through the subcontract and the marriage contract in particular. Though I don't have time to go into the theoretical framing in any depth, I just want to flag the work of Charles Mills, who Deb used, I thought, to great effect in a recent American Anthropologist piece. I want to flag the work of Charles Mills and Carol Pateman, who, in their co-authored book, The Contract and Domination, argue, quote, that contract is the major mechanism through which unfree institutions are perpetuated and presented as free institutions, end quote. More specifically, they write that, quote, the global racial contract underpins the stark disparities of the contemporary world. So today I'll start with subcontracts, and I'll move to marriage contracts. By the time I came to know Eduardo in 2008, he had been a VAXA employee for 3 years. VAXA is an Ecuador-Guinean-owned subcontracting firm whose business it is to provide local laborers to international oil companies, a labor brokering niche widely referred to in the global oil industry as a body shop. Foreign firms with operations in Equatorial Guinea pay VAXA per worker hired, Voxa takes a cut of each payment and then pays their employees what remains. Eduardo's first job with Voxa was on an offshore rig in drilling and lab analysis. After one hitch or marea, a rotating work schedule I'll describe in a moment, the contract between the company which owned the rig, Sea Trekker, and the operating company renting the rig expired, and the rig moved out of Ecuador-Guinean waters. After a mere 2 weeks on the job, Eduardo was out of work. His fellow subcontracted workers on the rig, Filipino, Scottish, and Venezuelan men, among others, stayed with the rig as it moved on to Angola or Nigeria or Ghana because their subcontracts were with Laurel, an international body shop whose contracts remained extant, irrespective of national borders. Guineans, including Eduardo, were left behind as their subcontracts were a fleeting product of what's called a local content requirement. These are contractual clauses that require international firms to employ a certain number of local workers. Clauses that lose their power once the relevant contract, in this case a rig rental, moves beyond national borders. After his first job sailed, Voxa sent Eduardo to work for the Breffield Corporation in the construction of a power plant on the Endurance oil compound. And I happen to know that there are 3 people who have spent quite a bit of time in Equatorial Guinea in this room, and they, if not others, will notice that all of these are pseudonyms, so I'm not using the real names of these companies. Voxa sent Eduardo to work for the Breffield Corporation in the construction of a power plant on the Endurance oil compound. Eduardo worked on this project for 4 months, up to the completion of the project and the end of Breffield's contract with Endurance. From there, Voxa sent Eduardo to Hume Tools, another oil services firm, this time to work as a security guard for 4 months, after which that contract with Voxa expired as well. After the Hume job, Voxa sent Eduardo and other employees home because there wasn't any available work. When I met him, Eduardo had again been contracted by Voxa and had been working for 2 months as a security guard outside a Schaefer Corp residence, another global oil services company with small private compounds housing foreign workers in Equatorial Guinea. On the job a mere 2 months when we met, not only had Eduardo already been switched from one Schaefer Corp house to another, but he had also been told that he now no longer even worked for Voxa, whose contracts had been taken over by another local body shop. This month, Eduardo explained with a wry grin, we are with Silvano. It is difficult to overstate the extent to which subcontracts and subcontracted workers saturate every level of the hydrocarbon commodification process. The proliferation of subcontractors in a given oil concession stretches from tool companies to catering companies, rig companies to road builders, transoceanic tankers to seawater sprayers, audit, tax, consulting, and financial advisory services to shipping and supply chain management companies. Subcontracts literally people the oil industry in its production sites in a way that the larger contracts between oil companies and the Ecuador-Guinean state do not. The actual commodity chain of a barrel of oil that the general public understands to be a Shell product or a BP product is in fact produced by hundreds of companies and thousands of employees, only a tiny fraction of whom are directly contracted by Shell or whoever the operating company may be. So to illustrate, the rig I visited at the end of the helicopter ride with which I started had 115 men on board, only 4 of whom worked directly for the operating company, and only 25 of whom worked directly for the rig company. The remaining 86 men were hired from 15 different subcontracting companies, bringing the total number of companies at work on one rig to 17. Among the men on board that rig, contracted by multiple firms and recruited from multiple countries, there were unambiguous working hierarchies. The offshore installation manager was at the top, with 3 supervisors under him, 4 leads under them, and then a series of workers organized by levels, 2 through 5. 5 was the lowest. On this rig, as well as other rigs I studied, white Americans, Brits, and Canadians held the top positions without exception, with nationalities diversifying through the middle and Ecuador-Guinean workers at the bottom. On this rig visit, the 2 highest positions were held by a white American and a white Australian. White Norwegian, English, and Canadian workers held all of the supervisory and technical positions, with Russian, French, Filipino, American, Colombian, Venezuelan, and Serbian workers in middle positions like field engineer, mudlogger, crane operator, or directional driller. With few exceptions, Ecuador-Guineans occupied bottom positions on the rig, 11 of the 14 catering personnel, painter, welder, roustabout, which is an industry term for unskilled labor, floor hand, and assistant driller, among others. On the small claustrophobic rig, men are assigned sleeping quarters according to their level, with those at the top in private rooms and those at the bottom in bunks that hold 4 or more people. Nationality is central to this form of labor organization. International body shops like Laurel, which I'll discuss at length in a minute, set each worker's pay and rotation schedule according to his nation of origin. So according to this system of differentiation, US and UK laborers work a 28-28, 28 days on in Equatorial Guinea and 28 days off at home, considered to be the best schedule. Filipino workers have the least desirable schedule, 11 weeks on and 3 weeks off, or an 11-free. Firms, including those in my research, have long argued that wage, schedule, and facilities segregation is not a question of racism, but of skill level. And of course, increasingly specialized methods of oil extraction, offshore, oil sands, shale oil, require increasingly specialized labor and minimal unskilled labor. These requirements then map on to geographic inequalities in the production and dissemination of technical knowledge. And yet, even the Ecuadorians who occupied semi-technical positions, radio or crane operator, one friend who had a master's level petroleum engineering degree from France, complained repeatedly that they were kept indefinitely at the level of trainee. When they bring a South African, and he's talking about a white South African, he doesn't specify, but when they bring a white South African, I have to guide him, but I'm the trainee. I spend 6 months showing him the work, and once these 6 months are finished, he becomes my boss, and I'm still the trainee. In other words, unequal opportunities for training and education aside, even when 2 workers do the same job, subcontracting arrangements licitly categorize, schedule, and pay workers according to their nationality, a categorization that often maps too neatly onto race, and we can talk about how that works in the Q&A. Because Eduardo's job came through an Ecuadorian subcontracting firm, and because of the weak compulsion of local content clauses, his experience in these hierarchies of rank was more precarious still, as he was unpredictably ejected from and then looped back into this subcontracting arrangement. Non-Ecuadorians, by contrast, were hired by foreign body shops like Laurel Incorporated, a Scottish company with main offices in Houston, which, for tax and litigation purposes, is registered and operates out of Cyprus. From their office in Equatorial Guinea, Laurel Incorporated matched transnational laboring bodies with labor needs in the local oil and gas industry. Paulo, a finance manager for Laurel, originally from Ecuador, explained, quote, "Here we provide manpower, which is called in the worst kind of way, body shops. I don't feel proud of that," end quote. Reminiscent of the colonial conservatorship that brought Liberians and Sierra Leoneans into Equatorial Guinea's cocoa economy, Laurel recruits and administers labor from around the world for operating companies and oil service companies. Once hired, Laurel coordinates workers' logistics, from plane tickets to visas, spending money to intermittent health insurance. Companies pay Laurel for workers' costs, plus an additional 18%. After taking their cut, Laurel then pays the employees. Those who find work through Laurel can be fired without notice, and they are likewise free to quit at any time. Reflecting on how often people quit and how often they were fired, Paulo explained, quote, "You play with people like chess pieces. The lie," he said, "is that you work for stability, benefits, Social Security, but here nothing. They just pay you what you earn that day. The business doesn't take anything from your check, you don't take anything from them, and they pay you a little higher rate, but not enough to make up the difference," end quote. In the temporalities of this payment setup, men are paid and insured only when they are working. Because they work on the rotating schedules that I just described, this means that they are paid and insured for 2 months while on the rig, for example, and then go home for 2 months without pay or insurance of any kind. Of the approximately 1,000 workers Laurel Incorporated managed in Equatorial Guinea during my field work, company documents show that roughly 40% were Filipino, 20% were British, 15% were Indian or Pakistani, 10% were from the US, another 10% were from South America, and as Paulo said, the majority of them are Venezuelan because they have oil skills, they're good labor, and they're cheap, and also because Chavez fired 18,000 employees 3 years ago who tried to unionize, end quote. The remaining 5%, for those of you who are doing the math, were a mix of Lebanese, Italian, and French. When I asked Paolo why schedules vary by nationality, he replied, quote, "They say it's the market. Companies take advantage of inequality in the economies of the world. Some people say that it's discrimination, and it is up to a certain point, but it's also working with the rules of the economy. You bring in 10 Filipinos for one American guy, same human being working the same 10 hours with equal or better knowledge, and your business is running," end quote. Here, we begin to see how the labor market, in this case, is not merely deepening forms of global inequality. Rather, the market for labor, what is for sale, at what cost, and to whom, is made by these inequalities. As Anand Singh has written, quote, "No firm has to personally invent patriarchy, colonialism, war, racism, or imprisonment, yet each of these is privileged in supply chain labor mobilization," end quote. "You're paid according to your passport," explained Paolo. Even he, as a finance manager, was paid as an Ecuadorian national. Quote, "I'm an administrative manager very high up in the company, but I'm paid as a third country national, even though I don't have a house in Ecuador and I want to live in Australia." Alden, I didn't see you here. Hey. Despite his management position, his tertiary degree in finance, and the fact that he had no home in Ecuador and was in fact in the process of migrating to Australia, Paolo was paid according to his passport, guaranteeing a lower wage. Many US passport holders, on the other hand, actually lived in the Philippines or Central America. As American oil men, they had met their wives in previous assignments in Venezuela or Indonesia and now rotated to those sites between hitches. But their passport guaranteed that they were still paid the US wage. All of these details belie any industry attempt to explain wage and scheduling inequalities through skills hierarchies, and show instead how the transnational labor market operates as a form of national and racial arbitrage. The preponderance of Filipino labor in Equatorial Guinea's oil industry is particularly illustrative of how histories of colonialism and racialized imaginaries constitute global markets. 1 out of 3 workers at sea today is Filipino. In explaining this phenomenon to me, a white expatriate country manager offered his own naturalization. Quote, "Worldwide in shipping, there's a lot of Filipinos. Why? They're English speaking, they have a willingness to work, good attitudes, they're good workers, friendly. If you go to Saudi, Kuwait, UAE, they have millions. For our liquid natural gas facilities, they went to the source of inexpensive but English-speaking, highly educated workforce. Over the years," he continued to explain, "it's become a tradition with Filipino labor, and it's almost generational. Their grandparents, aunts, and uncles were all involved in this sort of industry. In the early years, it was exploitation, low wages, poor living conditions, but you found people willing to do it. What we find now is that the wages for these third world people are creeping up worldwide," end quote. In this man's explanation, Filipinos are English-speaking, highly educated, willing to work, and friendly. Moreover, it is traditional in their extended families to work at sea. How did this tradition of maritime work and this widespread characterization of Filipinos as docile workers come to be? These naturalized and racialized explanations of the preponderance of Filipinos in an American-dominated industry have a very specific history. The US Navy was resegregated after World War I. At the time, the Philippines was a territory of the US, and Filipinos took the place of African-American seamen, receiving English language nautical training in American colonial institutions in the Philippines. 3 years in the Navy qualified Filipino men for American citizenship, and over 100,000 per year applied for menial steward jobs. With their demographically dominant but hierarchically subordinate position in global shipping well established by the time the Philippines gained independence from the US in 1946, the newly independent state began to market its populations as good subordinates, from men in shipping to women in nursing and domestic work. The state marketed its citizens as possessing inherent traits of docility and loyalty, as the Philippine Seafarer Promotion Council claimed in its motto, quote, "in loyal service to God, country, and company." Here we see how the global labor market is made in the colonial relationship of the Philippines to the shipping industry, or Chavez's firing of unionized workers. Labor supply and demand is made by the Jim Crow segregation of the US Navy and the coercive promise of citizenship for exploitation to Filipino colonial subjects. Remember that Paolo described this labor market as discrimination up to a certain point, beyond which, he said, it was the rules of the economy. To think about this relationship between discrimination and the rules of the economy a bit more, I want to share Paulo's slightly longer explanation of the practice of hiring by nationality. Quote, "You have first, second, and third world. Of course, if you're a US citizen going to South America, you have more spending power. Your money is more solid than local money. A barrel of oil is sold in dollars. If you have the possibility to bring people from other parts of the world and hire them by paying them what would be considered an acceptable wage for their position back in their home country, you really at the end don't have a problem. You're satisfying their needs, having a good wage, and the company is making millions of dollars. You bring in 10 Filipinos for one American guy, same human being working the same 10 hours with equal or better knowledge, and your business is running. All the machinery is running, you're pumping oil and gas, and you're selling it abroad. Oil price is standardized all around the world, so there is the gap. People are expendable," end quote. For Paulo, trained in economics, the certain point past which these hiring processes were not discriminatory was to be found in the rules of the economy. The fungibility of 10 Filipinos for one American, the spending powers of American dollars in a South American economy, barrels of oil sold in dollars, a hard currency denomination that indexes the geographies of power in which the oil industry operates. Where labor value varies radically across the furiously maintained borders of nations, genders, and races, the price of oil, while unstable over time, is largely stable across space. The LIBOR rate, or Platts market wire, list the globally agreed upon price per barrel for oil daily, and yet there is no analogous procedure for labor. Or perhaps more accurately, there is an analogously licit and market-based procedure for determining labor value, with a radically different outcome. Laurel uses a rating system devised by Moody's and Standard & Poor's, both of which are ratings agencies that sell financial market research and analysis to investors, to determine wages by nationality, from Americans and Brits at the top to TCNs, or third country nationals, at the bottom. On the one hand, then, an idea of the market absolves charges of discrimination or racism, while on the other hand, the very methods, tools, and metrics that make the market proxy for already existing categories of inequality, as in S&P's use of first, second, and third worlds. Accreted histories of racialized inequality, including African Americans being kicked out of the US Navy and replaced by Filipino colonial subjects, or Paulo himself, underpaid for his skill set as a financial manager because of his passport, proxy for rational, neutral market behavior, the rules of the economy. The market is not taking advantage of these circumstances. It is constituted by them. If this section has shown segregation and racial meaning-making to be the material out of which subcontracts are made, and in turn the world's most profitable and geopolitically strategic commodity gets to market, in this next section, I'll stay with segregation and add intimacy, white heterosexual intimacy in particular, to that argument. I will show the intimate couple to be, in Beth Pavanelli's words, quote, a key transfer point between, on the one hand, liberal imaginaries of contractual economics, politics, and sociality, and on the other, liberal forms of power in the contemporary world. The wives of expatriate managers were my easiest informal entry into the industry early in my fieldwork, and I spent considerable time with them in their luxurious gated enclaves on the outskirts of Equatorial Guinea's capital city. My ease of entry emanated from a form of white racial sorority, fictive kinship, where these women looked at me and often said, or seemed to think, "You could be my daughter." Because all three companies forbid expatriate workers from bringing children to Equatorial Guinea for reasons that stretched from malaria to lack of adequate schooling to security concerns, the women were mostly in their 50s and 60s, dearly missing children in their 20s and beyond at home, and I was in my late 20s at the time and turned 30 during fieldwork. These women were from New York, and Savannah, Georgia, Ipswich and London, England, Ogden, Utah, Conroe and Georgetown and Houston, Texas, rural Louisiana and the Midwest. There was one Brazilian woman I worked with who lived in the compound, married to an Argentinian man. While she considered herself to be white and was considered white by others in Brazil, by her own description, she made it clear to me that on the compound she felt distinctly non-white. Two other women, one Filipina and one Thai, married to white men, rounded out the non-white presence at our weekly gatherings. Nearly all of the women had lived in Texas with the industry, and between them they had also been posted in Angola, Argentina, Ecuador, England, Gabon, Indonesia, Ireland, Japan, Nigeria, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and throughout the US Gulf Coast. Many of these women pitied me. You live in the city? Don't you want to take a shower? They invited me to cards on Wednesdays, mahjong on Tuesdays, stitching on Thursdays. They invited me to present a seminar on women in Africa. They invited me as a friend, translator, or mere tag-along to their charity drives and outings to the city or around the island. They invited me to potlucks to say goodbye to someone leaving for a new post with her husband in Kazakhstan, retirement to a lake house in Wisconsin, or back to Texas. When I left the field, they threw me a potluck of my own. I played Continental with them every Wednesday afternoon. Chat over the game would turn to predictable questions. What did you do before? At my table of card players on one afternoon, one woman had been a tennis pro, one a banker, one had a degree in recreation and led a YWCA. Another's father had died young, and she had to take care of her mother. She explained softly that she didn't get the chance to earn a college degree. Other women I came to know had degrees or careers in law enforcement and police administration, library science, nursing, education, sociology and psychology, fashion, and interior design. Others had a high school education. Many were gifted artists, one a jeweler. All of them were in Equatorial Guinea to support their husbands in what was widely acknowledged to be an egregiously work-intensive environment. Reminiscing about her own career, Scarlett explained, quote, "Oh, I've worked in retail as a secretary, been a mom, wife, and professional volunteer. I never got to pursue my dreams. In my late 30s and early 40s, I grieved the loss of that. I've had a wonderful life. We've been corporate nomads," end quote. Or Sarah, who had worked as a nurse, explained, quote, "I can get a job anywhere. My husband does appreciate that I could be at home working, with an identity more or less. I gave that up, and he never takes it for granted," end quote. On the compounds where these women lived with their husbands, housing is divided according to position within the company, but again maps too neatly onto racial categories. These women lived either in the large suburban US-style homes reserved for upper management, or in condominiums for mid-level management, equally well appointed with flat-screen televisions, state-of-the-art appliances, and phones with Houston area codes. The rotator camp was one step below the condominiums in the housing hierarchy. Pictured here are large apartment building structures where men, exclusively, lived, two to a suite, with separate bedrooms and bathrooms, and a shared common room. The majority of workers in the rotator camp were Filipino, but others at this occupational level, which is mid-level engineers, electricians, and plant operators, included men from India and Pakistan, Venezuela, Mexico, Ecuador, Turkmenistan, and Kazakhstan, as well as the US Gulf Coast. All men in these facilities are subcontracted labor and do not work directly for the operating company. These men were not permitted to bring partners into Equatorial Guinea, despite the fact that some of their rotations were up to 1 year long. They had no cooking facilities and were expected to eat in the canteen for every meal, though many had hot pots in their common areas. At the bottom of this residential hierarchy were the barracks, a series of modular dwellings lined up in parallel rows. So there are two trailers. There's like one long trailer right here, and then there's a little hallway in between, and there's one long trailer with kind of an edifice built outside of the long trailers. A series of modular dwellings lined up in parallel rows. The barracks were long, trailer-wide corridors with doors off of either side onto shared bedrooms and bathrooms. They had no cooking facilities and no family was permitted. Originally built by the US company that had constructed Equatorial Guinea's liquid natural gas plant, their subcontractors had been mostly Indian, and many still referred to the camp as Indian Camp. By the time I got to Equatorial Guinea some years later, the barrack residents were majority Filipino, Indian, and Pakistani. Not only were both the barracks and the rotator camp obviously inferior to management housing, but they also had separate recreational facilities, including a small pool and their own bar. By comparison, management had access to an Olympic pool, a full-size gym, and a luxurious clubhouse and restaurant on the compound. Non-white men away from home for long periods of time were not fully welcome in that recreational environment. One white American expat wife told me she had recently seen some Filipinos coming to her gym. Quote, "They're here for a year alone without a break," she said. "Seeing them in the gym creeps me out." End quote. Equatorial men and women who work in the oil industry, regardless of level, are forbidden from living in these compounds. In the spatial segregation of these enclaves, we should see another configuration of the spatial segregation on rigs, or the compensation discrimination by passport. Of residential segregation in the oil industry, Penn's own Bob Vitalis, who is teaching right now, but hopefully we'll see him later, has written, quote, Texaco, Chevron, Exxon, and Mobil accumulated decades of experience in dozens of locales, and they laid out each field and camp everywhere the same way, decade after decade, with the labor force divided, segregated, and paid different wages according to race, end quote. Here, Vitalis was focusing exclusively on the implicitly male worker, as I did in the previous section on subcontracting. What I want to show in this final ethnographic section, in dialogue with feminist anthropology, is how domestic arrangements of marriage and kinship are political and economic affairs constitutive of capitalist practice. I'm interested in how the segregation of the enclaves, not only from life, quote unquote, outside their walls, but perhaps more importantly, race and class segregation within their walls, is evidence of the cultural work required to enliven the licit life of capitalism. How, for instance, reproducing the heterosexual married couple, if only for the highest and almost always white managers, comes to signify a certain kind of licit practice in which white, not white, is semiotically mapped onto tenuous infrastructural and technical distinctions between West and not West, standard and corrupt, global and local. Segregation and intimate life, paradoxically, come to signify heightened standardization, repetition, and universality, drawing on select post-colonial meanings attributed to whiteness, including expertise, virtue, technology, meritocracy, and philanthropy. The white women with whom I played cards, the caretakers of white male physical well-being, and the guardians of racialized morality and privilege, I'm channeling Stoller here, are a constitutive piece of the licit life of capitalism in Equatorial Guinea. Mauricio, an Ecuadorian functionary in the Ministry of Finance, who had also worked for a US oil firm for years before transitioning into government, explained compound life to me. They don't live in Malabo, he said. They live in Houston. In the major corporation, just to be clear, this is not in Houston, this is in Bata, Equatorial Guinea, sorry to be clear. In the major corporation, we even used to have rules in terms of when you could go out and when you could come back home to the compound. You can't keep company in the compound, guys or girls. They're never outside of that compound unless they're on the bus to the airport, end quote. While the amount of time expatriate employees spent off their compounds for personal purposes or recreational purposes varied, there was a common refrain among North American or European single male rotators that I talked to, quote, I rarely if ever go out in public, from the rig to the office. I've rotated into Equatorial Guinea for 6 years and I've probably spent 30 nights in Malabo. I've maybe gone out for dinner 12 times. One of my Ghanaian employees says he's disappointed I've never come to his house for dinner, end quote, or another. I live here like I did in Angola, from the airport to the rig. In Angola, there was a civil war. Some people like going into town. I want to eat my dinner here and go to sleep. In Aberdeen, we were part of the culture. In China, it's not a camp situation. I spent time in the city, but I didn't go out a lot, but that's just me. There have been those that partake of the nightlife in Bata, which is discouraged. There was one guy who couldn't ever make it back to camp the same night, and they moved him offshore. End quote. Partaking of the nightlife, as some of these chuckles might be imagining, in this man's account is a euphemism for engaging with sex workers. This man talks about a type of man he defines himself against, a man who, whether in China, Equatorial Guinea, or Angola, likes to go out a lot. Certainly, there are many men in the oil industry in Equatorial Guinea who meet Ghanaian women and offer them money, meals in restaurants, and sometimes even more stable arrangements of housing and a living allowance in exchange for companionship and sex. In an effort to constrain this behavior, the large US oil compounds all have curfews, ostensibly for security and to ensure a well-rested worker in the morning, but certainly also as a way to control alcohol consumption and sex, two of the main attractions outside compound walls. Who can and cannot bring wives to the compounds becomes more salient here. The apparent morality and dignity of white upper management is buttressed by their domestic arrangement that either keeps them home at night or encourages them to socialize with other married white couples in luxurious housing. By contrast, lower-level workers, the vast majority of whom are men and not white, away from home alone for up to a year at a time, are more likely to leave their claustrophobic compound housing after work. Remember from the earlier descriptions that they have no kitchens, no living room areas, and live in dorm-style or trailer-wide facilities. Given that many of these workers are also from the global south, Equatorial Guinea beyond the walls was far less exotic or threatening to them, and many enjoyed the opportunity to frequent bars and nightclubs beyond the gaze of their bosses, whether or not they engaged with sex workers or more long-term companions. Notice too that for men who didn't make it back to camp before the curfew, an offshore posting was punishment, further racializing questions of work and sexual morality. In short, the enclave and its outside are intensely gendered spaces in which sexuality and kinship, who was frequenting sex workers, who could or could not have wives with them, became tied up in labor control and hierarchies of privilege. The wives, of course, inhabited these regulations and hierarchies differently, and segregation both outside and inside the walls took on very different meanings and potentialities for them than it did for their husbands and other male workers. The women I came to know were accustomed to expatriate life and its particular rhythms, its comings and goings. The woman leaving for Kazakhstan went for a look-see to find out what she would need there, what kinds of clothes she should bring. When she returned to Equatorial Guinea to pack up her house, she turned to me and, referring to an earlier conversation we had had, said, "You know, it's just like we were talking about. There's a whole subculture there ready to show me where to change money, wives calling me ready to pick me up." The wives in any given place had most often lived in many other places and were accustomed not only to the transience of this existence, but also to its continuities. Chief among these continuities are the reliability of transnational meanings attached to whiteness and the political potency of the heteronormative and deeply gendered family structure. The expat wives' prayer, which need not be legible to you, I'm going to read you a part of it, I just wanted you to get a sense of the sort of aesthetic feel of it. The expat wives' prayer is a poignant and troubling artifact of these continuities, given to me by one of the women with whom I worked in Equatorial Guinea. The poem is a satirical reinterpretation of the Lord's Prayer that circulates broadly in American expatriate communities the world over, on the internet, and in Equatorial Guinea, though the woman who eventually gave me this copy was clearly ashamed to do so, and I'll read you an excerpt. Heavenly Father, look down on us, your blessed and humble expat wives, following our loved ones through their working lives, traveling this earth to lands unknown. We beseech you, O Lord, to see that our plane is not hijacked, our luggage is not lost or pillaged, and our overweight baggage goes unnoticed. Oh, it gets so much better. Just wait. Give us divine guidance in our selection of houses, cooks, maids, drivers, and gardeners. Help the natives love us, Lord, for what we are, not for what we appear to be worth. Grant us the strength to smile at our maids over shrunken laundry and broken treasures, remembering our own mistakes in menial matters. Give us divine patience when we again explain our way of doing things. Almighty Father, keep our husbands from comparing us to foreign women. Save them from making fools of themselves in nightclubs, and please, Lord, do not forgive them their trespasses, for they know exactly what they do. Okay, so first, I want to simply recognize white supremacy here by Ansley's definition. Quote, a political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources, conscious and unconscious ideas of white superiority are widespread, and relations of white dominance and non-white subordination are daily reenacted across a broad array of institutions and social settings. It's a quote from a Cornell Law Review article, 1989. Ansley is the woman's name. This poem is saturated with white property claims, excess baggage, houses, treasures, what we appear to be worth, and relations of white dominance and non-white subordination, cooks, maids, drivers, gardeners. Second, using this poem, I want to recognize the centrality of racialized sexuality in the long history of global capitalist projects. And if you don't know Kimberly K. Wang's recent book, Dealing in Desire, and you're interested in this stuff, you should totally read it. The natives in the poem are in one moment the expat wives, cooks, and maids, and in the next, foreign women against whom they compare unfavorably, and with whom their husbands should not be forgiven for having extramarital sex. In the penultimate line of the poem, the narrator hopes for friends. I didn't read this part to you. The narrator hopes for friends at the end of her nomadic life with whom to share her many memories, photos, and stories. Quote, so our lives as expat wives will not have been in vain. End quote. This line suggests that wedded domesticity itself, providing emotional and housework support to a husband through his corporate journeys, is not enough to redeem the hardships and sacrifices of this kind of life for these women. In the sadness of this line, in the sentiment of lives lived in vain, one can hear Scarlett again. I never got to pursue my dreams, and I grieved the loss of that. The intimately unequal domesticities of race, class, and gender expressed in the poem, the repetition of domestic segregation in oil compounds around the world, show us how the global oil industry draws on pre-existing systems of race and gendered inequality, not simply on norms and technologies of liberal capitalism. or rather, race and gendered inequality are norms and technologies of liberal capitalism. From subcontracting in body shops that pay workers according to their nation of origin, to the acceptability of residential segregation, to the moral weight of the white heterosexual married couple, many of the quotidian practices that constitute the daily life of capitalism are made through the reliability of already existing inequalities. But the affective experience of those inequalities is troubled, even for these women whose intersectional identities placed them at the apex of race and class, if not gender, hierarchies. For expatriate wives living in Equatorial Guinea, homosociality within the compounds, within the apparently homogeneous whiteness, was deeply cross-cut by multiple forms of difference, inequality, and prejudice. These included, but were not limited to, nationality. Americans are loud, Brits are uptight. These are what they tell me about the women they're living with. Class and social capital, who had more than high school education, who was from a small rural town. Differences between company policies and hierarchies within the companies themselves. Who was married to whom? Whose husband was whose husband's boss? And I'm going to skip a bunch of ethnographic detail about their charity projects and their complicated relationships to one another, but I encourage you to read the book. In general, the women felt that there was nowhere comfortable to turn. Wedded domesticity in Equatorial Guinea was insufficient. Reaching outside the compound via charity projects was fraught, and their relationships to one another were riven with tension and judgment. In this feeling of having nowhere to affectively rest, the compound's luxurious infrastructure and the wildly inflated salaries paid to their husbands would often become, somewhat ironically, the least problematic psychic space. As Madalena put it, the Brazilian woman I mentioned, "What I like about living here is the comfort in economic things. I didn't come here to do volunteer work. We came to make money." Frustrated by the complexity of other desires, the spectacular profit to be had by collecting a 75% uplift salary with all expenses paid in the hardship post of Equatorial Guinea became the least problematic justification for compound life. And indeed, if one could characterize expatriate management work in Equatorial Guinea by a unifying trope, it might be class mobility. One woman confided that she and her husband had $5 million cash in hand to buy an expansive ranch property in Texas. Another worked diligently via Skype in her free time, monitoring the building of her dream farmhouse in the French countryside. So to conclude, putting the ethnographic material on subcontracts and marriage contracts together, I want to suggest that the mobility of segregated domestic life within the compounds and the mobility of the technical, legal, and infrastructural forms like the rig or the subcontract rely on one another. They require one another for their licitness, for their performativity. The careful segregation of gendered and heteronormative married whiteness from its others, its cordoning off from Equatorial Guinea beyond the walls, and selective engagements via corporate social responsibility or philanthropy sanctifies, indeed domesticates, the power and sovereignty that U.S. oil companies wield in Equatorial Guinea and elsewhere. Conversely, all that complicated technology, offshore rigs and tankers, helicopters, liquid natural gas trains, aids and abets the forms of segregation and racialized inequality as skills hierarchy or expertise. The ability to appeal to standardized contracting practices the world over, or enclaved corporate life that ostensibly separates hydrocarbon production from corruption outside the walls, offer white supremacy what Cheryl Harris describes, quote, as the legal legitimation of expectations of power and control that enshrine the status quo as the neutral baseline while masking the maintenance of white privilege and domination, end quote. And this is how white supremacy, in Ansley's definition, comes paradoxically to be part of the licit life of capitalism, not its ugly underbelly. Okay, so we'll truly conclude by returning to the helicopter vignette with which I started to just say a little bit more about what I mean by the licit life of capitalism. The view from the helicopter, in which Equatorial Guinea seems to recede, in which hydrocarbons seem to move effortlessly from one infrastructural node of the commodity chain to another, in which a space referred to as the offshore seems to be a literal watery stage for placeless economic interaction, requires a tremendous amount of work. Manual, managerial, domestic, political labor, the work of material infrastructures and technologies, legal, ethical, and affective framing processes that are required to lubricate the passage of oil to market. The apparent smoothness of the offshore is made and remade in this quotidian project that is hydrocarbon capitalism in Equatorial Guinea. The view from the helicopter was redolent with qualities often thought to be intrinsic to capitalism itself: standardization, replicability, technical mastery, the disembedding of economic interaction from social context. In contrast, the view from 14 months of fieldwork in and around Equatorial Guinea's oil industry demonstrated nothing more than the work required to produce tenuous and contested approximations of those ostensibly intrinsic qualities. This is a classic anthropological argument, and perhaps one that the organizers of this had in mind, right, when they organized this year-long thing. Aha! Capitalism doesn't work as it claims to. As if, in showing capitalism to be a project, as if in showing it to be constituted by race and gendered inequalities, by local specificity, contingency, heterogeneity, I have somehow undone its apparent power. But the view from the helicopter window is not only misleading, right, ready to be debunked by us clever anthropologists, it is also productive. If anthropologists often concern ourselves with rescuing local specificity and complexity from the abstracting distance of views like this one, I am equally invested in understanding what these kinds of views do in the world. These views are not merely wrong in any narrow sense. On the contrary, they are performative in that they generate durable material and semiotic effects. Insofar as anthropologists approach these abstracting views as fodder for deconstruction, to show contingency, complexity, heterogeneity, locality within or beneath them, we fail to account for their performative work in the world. We seem to suggest that mere appearances are easily undone by ethnographic intimacy. On the contrary, something widely recognized as global capitalism persists, despite that kind of deconstructed work. Moving away from theories that attribute to capitalism a singular intrinsic systematicity on the one hand, or an endlessly varied, specific, and fractured form on the other, ethnography can help us follow the work required to make the as-ifs on which capitalism has so long relied. Abstraction, decontextualization, standardization, the rules of the market, the contract, the technology. This allows us to account for the relationship between capitalism's seeming coherence and power and the radically heterogeneous sites through which those qualities are made. I take these as-ifs themselves as ethnographic objects, as aspirational processes and political projects that we can follow in the field. Ethnography can show us how these as-ifs are not arrayed against or destabilized by the particularities of race or gender, in my case, but are made by them. To take abstraction, decontextualization, and standardization as ethnographic objects draws our attention to what I've been calling the licit life of capitalism. Contracts, subcontracts, economic theory, enclaves, transparency, these are practices that have become legally sanctioned, widely replicated, and even ordinary, at the same time as they are messy, contested, and as I've described them today, indefensible. Rather than paying critical attention to the scandals that saturate capitalism's daily life, not least in the oil industry and not least in sub-Saharan Africa, I suggest that oil in Equatorial Guinea counterintuitively offers an ideal place in which to explore what we might take to be the opposite of scandal. Contracts and rigs and markets were the assemblages of liberalism and racialized labor, technology and sexuality, gender and spatialized domesticity that made an industry operating on the edge of legitimacy and legality formally legitimate, legal, and productive of extraordinary profit. This approach to capitalism echoes Saidiya Hartman's approach to the routinized violence of slavery, in which she focuses not on invocations of the shocking and the terrible, but on, quote, those scenes in which terror can hardly be discerned. That capitalism is a project does not mean that it can be undone simply. That mere theoretical assertion does not show capitalism to be precarious. As this manuscript has gone through various iterations as articles and talks, I am constantly asked, get ready for it if it's your question, where is the resistance? Where is the otherwise? As an activist myself, I am both empathetic to those questions and skeptical of what they're asking for. Bringing capitalism's otherwises into being is a profound challenge that requires much more than simply calling it a project. Among other strategies, bringing capitalism's otherwises into being requires an intimate knowing of capitalism itself in all of its force and fulsomeness, a full confrontation with the fact that capitalism and white supremacy, capitalism and patriarchy are co-constituted and hence can't be separated in activist approaches. And it is to that project that I hope this book will contribute. Which as I was reading it, I was like, I have to cut this part out. Anyway, sorry. Thank you.
So now we'll open up for questions. Does anyone have any questions?
you want me to fill the question? Some people are nodding, the organizer is not looking.
Yes, question in the back.
What do you do with helicopters? No, sorry.
I can remember.
Well, it's interesting. So thinking about contracts, right? It's like this idea of an agreement, and I think you did a really interesting job of showing how it is that this agreement is actually constituted by a set of inequalities that become naturalized by the managerial class. I'm interested in what the laborers said about this agreement.
Yeah. What the laborers say about the agreements. So in the book, I have a whole chapter on this is like a very small part of the chapter on subcontracts, and a lot of the chapter deals precisely with this. So in Equatorial Guinea, before the arrival of U.S. oil companies, which was really in 1995, but it kind of mushroomed in 2005 to be a fully fledged industry, there was very little formal employment other than working for the government. So when the oil companies came to town, there was, in some ways, a kind of fluorescence of possibilities for local employment, formal local employment, including, of course, sex work and window washing, which I'm not talking about. And these kinds of subcontracting companies like Barracks, which I described, proliferated. And you have to, as an Equatorial Guinean, you have to pay to be considered to get one of these subcontracting jobs. So the ways that laborers talk about it first, they start talking about how they resent having to pay to be considered because they're so poor already. And then, especially when things go wrong at work, they don't get their pay, they get some kind of injury, and they're not given what they understand to be their due. So like, if you look at their pay stubs, one thing that is always coming out is like it's not social security, it's like some kind of medical tax or something. One person got sick and went to the hospital to collect the medicine, which she understood was to be subsidized by that tax that had come out of her paycheck, and it wasn't there. So when something like that goes wrong, another guy got his finger cut off on a rig. When something goes wrong, then what they say is, who is responsible for me in this maze of subcontractors? Because I go to VAXA, and VAXA says, oh, no, we don't really employ you. Sea-Trekker employs you. So then I go to the Sea-Trekker office, and Sea-Trekker says, oh, we don't really employ you. This is a Smith contract. And then I go to Smith, and going to any one of these offices is like a 3-week endeavor at the very least. It's not like you get an appointment and you sit in, right? So the sort of disappearance in the spider webs of liability that is precisely the intention of subcontracting, right? If you guys remember the Deepwater Horizon disaster, BP was like, it's Schlumberger, and Schlumberger was like, it's Halliburton, right? I mean, that's exactly what this is designed to do, and laborers feel that too. So whenever anything goes wrong, if they have any kind of labor grievance, they disappear in this maze, and both, as an act of solidarity and as an act of research, I went with a particular guy whose finger was cut off. I followed him through that maze, and he never got any kind of redress from anybody for that finger. After about 2 months, he gave up. I was like, we can keep going. And he was like, you're insane. So they say a lot of things, but those are some of them.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to ask about, when you spoke about the expat experiences of these expat things, and the sort of thread that we were looking at is something they share amongst themselves. And I was wondering about the expat experiences of some of the others, especially Africans, Asian, non-whites, and amongst themselves in these sort of camps, and when they go back perhaps, and what has brought them into this international sphere? Are they getting paid in dollars?
Totally. It's a great question. So the question is about, what about expatriates who are not the white people who I pay attention to? So that's a huge methodological shortcoming of, I'm going to speak to your question, but I want to be very honest up front. It's a huge methodological shortcoming of the book, in part because of the logistical arrangements of their lives, right? So they come for, some of them, up to a year at a time and live in that rotator camp, but that rotator camp has very few common spaces. They don't have kind of collective events. There was no way for me methodologically to kind of show up and hang out there, or they're on the rig, and so I got some access, I didn't get very much access. So it was very hard for me to hang out with those groups of people, except like kind of in bars and stuff like that, but even that was limited. So I have a very good sample of the white expatriates who have these kind of spacious social lives that they invited me into, and Equatorial Guineans, because I lived in the city, right? So we could all like hang out and be together. That said, it was not appropriate for me to go and hang out like in the rotator camp. It was also heavily policed. I wouldn't have been allowed to by management to go out and hang out in the rotator camp, like in the rooms. That said, I would say the communities, so it was really different, right? Because the Filipinos were up there for up to a year at a time. And so they had fairly robust social, like they had a church that they always went to, they had their own charity projects that they participated in, and had specific bars and restaurants that they kind of hung out in. They were paid in dollars. There aren't really expatriate Africans, very few. There's like a smattering of Nigerians and Angolans, at least that I met, but not many more. Indians and Pakistanis, like an Indian camp, were often hired through construction firms, very rarely social services firms. There was, oil services firms. But I would say it really varied by how long their hitches were, right? Because so Filipinos, because they were there for up to a year at a time, very clearly had this well-established social life in Equatorial Guinea, whereas many of the other hitches were much shorter or were much more irregular, and so it was really like, I'm just gonna work and then get the fuck out of here. But everybody was paid in dollars. Yeah. Sorry. We're not doing it.
So, wonderful talk. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'm really intrigued by and interested in the performativity hypothesis that you're putting forth here. And a question that I have about that, though, would be to put it into a longer temporal context. Obviously, it's 1995 and post that we're talking about, which is an age of outsourcing, which begins really in the 1960s. And before that, in fact, if you look at the oil industry, going back into the 19th century, it's all taking place primarily in the United States. Began here in Pennsylvania in the 1850s, was it? Something like that.
Yeah.
But anyway, all domestic, and eventually does move offshore to other places. When it moves to Saudi Arabia, it's a very different kind of phenomenon than when it goes to other parts of the world. Are you talking really about the performativity of these ideas of inequality and disparity that are prior to the operation of market forces? So a lot of these companies are actually being pushed out, they think they're being pushed out at least by the idea that labor costs are rising and so forth. Oil is a little different from other aspects of outsourcing.
Yeah.
But it follows the model then of the outsourcing that takes place in other industries.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So what's the timeline of what I am describing, specifically the timeline of subcontracting and outsourcing, and does the performativity kind of frame work earlier than that? Yes, I'm so glad you're asking me this question. So also in the subcontracting chapter, I do a lot of work to problematize what have become kind of accepted teleologies of post-Fordism in anthropology or late capitalism. Even when you look subcontracting or outsourcing up in the dictionary, it'll sort of date it from exactly the kind of dates you give, right? The late 80s, early 90s. But the oil industry predates that by 100 years. Extensive, intensive out. So if you read Jeff Bowker's History of Schlumberger, for instance, so Schlumberger, Halliburton, these are massive oil service companies that have been operating for, at least a century now. So when we think about early oil plays in Saudi, early oil plays in South America, Schlumberger is there, Halliburton is there, right? It's not, and yes, of course, at that point, what's called Standard Oil is there, but there's already a network of oil service companies and sort of specializations. Shipping, Esso, Standard Oil, Esso, that was originally a shipping company, right? So the kinds of commodity chain fragmentation and labor subcontracting that many of us, me included, have sort of accepted as like a certain kind of teleology in late capitalism that starts at this point but didn't exist prior to it, is absolutely empirically false in the oil industry. So that's one thing that I would say. The other thing I would say is that many of my interlocutors, my management interlocutors, would narrate things along those lines, but then they would be like, but in Russia, we don't do this. In Russia, we keep it all in-house, right? So even now, in an era of sort of saturated with these forms of subcontracting and labor, commodity chain fragmentation, you see the country to country, they have radically different practices. So I think there are all kinds of ways that simplified teleology is problematized by like a close look at the empirics, at least in what I've read in oil in particular. It sounds like in your impression of Saudi, and I know you now have a very deep impression of it, it's different. But like even in Vitalis...
Actually very similar in many respects to what you were describing.
Okay, yeah.
Although the racial hierarchies don't work that way because it's Saudis that are in
Sure.
charge of everything there.
Yeah, although the paradigmatic book on this is Vitalis's book
I know,
about
I
Appel.
totally disagree with Bob on that regard.
Yeah.
It's a brilliant book.
Yeah, yeah.
But once you get inside and you see how people are making decisions
Yeah.
inside the company, it
Yeah.
looks just a little bit different.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for this talk, this fascinating. I was really intrigued. Just the way that gender is so kind of bifurcated. It's almost like a replication of a colonial household, or it is. But I was wondering, did you encounter women who actually worked in these companies or on? Or I mean, what happens when women are actually associated or working with the companies? Does that change the dynamic? Is it so infrequent that it's actually impossible to analyze? I was wondering if you kind of encountered
Yeah.
situations.
So I was there for about a year and a half, solidly. I was there before that, for like 3 months of preliminary fieldwork before I went for that year and a half. And over that year and a half, there was one woman who worked as a corporate social responsibility manager, which is very high up in the company, especially in a location like this, for one of the companies. And she was quite visible, and she, of course, is not going to show up at this, right? Because she's working, right? So, and then I encountered one female rig worker who I did not have a chance to interview. I was leaving the rig on a helicopter, and she was coming, and I was like, "Who is that?" I actually because their hitches change. Like there's one day when the hitches change, and like all the helicopters leave, and then all the helicopters come. It's like this really. To them, it's this very regimented and organized thing. I was like, what the fuck is going on? I'm just standing in line. This is really scary. It's like really loud. And I saw a woman get off the helicopter, and I literally said, as our helicopter was taking, does anybody know who that is? And they're all like, no. So she was the only person I saw there. And there are Aquatic Guinean women who are subcontracted as maids, as cooks, as sort of house help, and I talk with them extensively in the book and in field research. But of course, the experiences of gender that I'm talking about and that I talk specifically about today were of these women who are married to the expatriate men. So when I talk about the women who work as maids, I talk more about what the very first question was, is like, how do they relate to their subcontracts? How do they relate to their bad pay? They see these women and they know that, so I don't know if I was clear about this, but these families don't have to pay anything in Equatorial Guinea. So they get their salary plus an additional 75% of their salary, but their housing, their food, their electricity, they have no bills, they have no costs whatsoever. Whereas these women who get a good salary for Equatorial Guinea, right, are paying incredible fees in, as costs skyrocket in a petro-inflated economy and are barely making ends meet. So they talked a lot about those kinds of inequalities and anger about that. I don't know if I answered your question.
Good enough, one or two more, please.
Maybe building on your earlier question about like Saudi Arabia and stuff like that, like what role does the state have in Equatorial Guinea, for instance, have versus maybe a state with higher capacity like UAE or Saudi
Totally.
in establishing how these hierarchies play out? I mean, some of it seems like it's global everywhere.
Yeah.
And it's almost seems to be this variation of sort of Russia.
Totally. So I think a lot of it is state capacity, and a lot of it, and I will address that directly, and a lot of it is the sort of trajectory of an oil concession, right? So even if you look at a place with a ton more capacity, Angola, let's just look at neighbors for a minute, right? Like if you look at Angola, if you look at Nigeria, their national oil companies, their national gas companies, their local content clauses, their training of their people, sending them to Houston for 10 years at a time to get real expertise in petroleum engineering is radically different than Equatorial Guinea's has been. And that's in part because oil showed up in Nigeria and Angola in the 50s, in the 60s, right? So they went through this obscenely exploitative phase a long time ago, and part of the obscene exploitation is written into contract terms, right? Because of the kinds of inequalities of global technological norms, especially at that time in the 50s and 60s, an oil company comes to you and you're in Nigeria, and they say, hey, look, we might be able to extract billions of dollars, but we're not sure, and here's the awful terms that you can sign up to just to see if that's true. They're like, okay, sure, let's check it out. And then over time, the contract gets renegotiated as there's more state capacity. So Equatorial Guinea didn't even have a law on the books about, as some of my friends in the back might be able to attest to, about offshore pollution, right? And why would they? There were no so it's even less an issue of state capacity than what becomes important in like a legislative framework, in a labor regulation framework, once the oil industry comes to town, and it's very hard to anticipate that, especially if you're a pariah state in the way that Equatorial Guinea is, right? So I would say, and then the irony of all this is that as your state capacity builds and builds, which is certainly happening in certain ways in Equatorial Guinea, your reserves are dwindling and dwindling and dwindling, right? So now Equatorial Guinea, and companies know that, and so they sign up in the original contract to take as much as possible, as fast as possible, so that by the time you're like, oh shit, pay our people to go get trained, they're like, yeah, but we're only gonna be here for like a year more, so sorry. You know, and that's kind of where we are in Equatorial Guinea right now, I would say. So the state has certainly gained a tremendous amount of capacity. They have been sending people overseas, but the oil's about to run out. Liquid natural gas might last for a little bit longer. So it really is, I mean, for them, I was just talking to a dear friend of mine who has, in the interim, become a fairly high-up minister, and he was like, we're in a mad dash to figure out how we can use these next 5 or 6 years the best we possibly can before we're a pariah again.
Yes.
I have a question about the Constitution and your reproduction of in these kind of racial national hierarchies of labor, cost, as well as you just mentioned about state capacity. I guess the question kind of comes from the way when you sort of say how that's simply not the market taking advantage of, but rather the market is constituted by them. So that kind of leads me to sort of ask a little more, elaborate your arguments. Well, is there a market logic that kind of plays into this? Because it sort of sounds more like the market's kind of blossoming over these sort of histories of inequality, which you kind of sort of emphasize are historically produced. In the sense of historically produced being kind of the obverse of market produced, in which is not like an agent of the market, it just kind of happens. So I'm kind of wondering, and that kind of means the question, which you didn't mention, was the question of reproduction. So is there an argument about the reproduction of inequality, and is that through a market logic? And I think as an example is about sort of these racialized segregations that are not seen to be racial, that is not written down as this is race-based. So that leads to the question of when those boundaries, if those boundaries do get violated, if someone does, if there is crossover, if someone, say in the Philippines, does sort of enter into that space, how do people sort of react to that? I mean, are there these sort of moments where that gets destabilized because of the market logic, whatever it does kind of work its way into the edges?
Okay, so the first question about reproduction and market logics, I see them, they're related questions, but I'll take that kind of separately to begin with. Yeah, so I am making this argument. I feel like anthropology and sort of broader critical approaches to capitalism have insisted, and rightly so, on this idea that market logics deepen inequality. That's true. I think that verb, deepen, one could replace that quite easily with reproduce, right? Reproduce, exacerbate, continue to make. And that's true. So is it generative of new kinds of inequalities, or does it deepen existing ones? Absolutely. But it leaves market logic undisturbed as this kind of thing that exists previous to that, and then comes into a system and disturbs it or reproduces it in the following way. And what I am saying is that insofar as markets proceed by valuing and devaluing things and finding moments of arbitrage, right? Finding moments where different things have different values and then capitalizing over that, right? That's like what the market efficiency hypothesis is based on, is like finding moments where things have different value and acting on that right away. Those inequalities, we have them, right? They're based on race, they're based on gender, they're based on histories of colonialism, but that's where they come from. So that's actually what markets do. That's where it's finding differences in value. That's why, I mean, so you think of the story about the US Navy being resegregated, right? So that particular moment in a kind of Jim Crow colonial US empire makes a certain kind of market. So it's not just that then deepened a certain form of inequality, it's that it actually crafted it. So does that have a reproductive capacity? Yes, but absolutely. Are there moments of destabilization? Absolutely, of course, we all perhaps, maybe I shouldn't generalize, hope to participate in those. But the thing that I really want to avoid or I want to add, I should say, is the idea that there's something called market logic that pre-exists these things, that exists outside of them, and we can put society back in, or we can put history back in, or we can put, as if they were ever separate from one another. They have never been separate from one another. We learn that they are. Even in our own critical work, we learn that they are. And I am trying to argue that they are not. And we imagine them to be at our peril for understanding how market logic actually works. And then to the question of racial boundaries, and they're not written, of course it doesn't say, Black and Asian people not allowed here, or Black and Asian people will only be paid half as much, and then what happens when those boundaries get violated. So I gave one, arguably insignificant, ethnographic anecdote about the woman when the Filipino guy came into her gym, right, that's how it's quoted in the paper, he came into my gym and it creeped me out. Right, so there are definitely those moments of sort of like affective racial intensities, but then there are other moments, so like there's this other kind of expatriate ritual that apparently happens all around the world called a hash. And it's this sort of like horrifying, somebody laughing, have you been to hashes? Okay, woo, it's really weird. But in Equatorial Guinea, sometimes people would hear about it who were outside the very protected network of how that was supposed to happen. So like there were a bunch of kind of higher up Nigerian people that would often come from the consulates. And it was super fucking awkward because there are some really racist parts of like the songs that they sing, and so there are definitely like transgressions of these orders. There was a very high up corporate social responsibility manager, an African American guy from Oakland, which is also where I'm from, which is why I'm specifying it. So there are also moments like that, but there are definitely transgressions. I mean, it's like really visible. I guess that's what I would say.
Question, probably was a great example from Saudi.
Yeah.
And the oil industry and gas industry is a global phenomenon, a
Yes.
global industry. And so I wonder to what degree, based on your work and comparative work, that you see these same forms of outsourcing and economic organization being mirrored in places which either might not be considered to be capitalist per se, such as China and the South Sea, or in Mexico, which has its own history of petroleum development. And there's both an underlying need to be able to actually find the fields, get the product, and move it to market. And so all are going to share those kinds of features in common. But to what degree do you see the same types of social organization, political interest in training one's own national personnel in these things to gain expertise and to actually maybe be the purveyors of this information globally in these different locations within this larger kind of industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. So his question is, comparatively speaking, how much might we see these same kind, and building off of Greg's question earlier, how much might we see these same kinds of like outsourcing trends elsewhere in places that we might not understand as sort of capitalist in any neat way? So Mexico, Norway, Venezuela, right, yes. So offshore oil has revolutionized the industry globally. It's revolutionized what it looks like on a daily basis. It's revolutionized the way that its labor forces are set up. So Mexico and Norway actually are paradigmatic examples of this. So in very different ways over their long histories, incredibly powerful national oil companies, right? Mexico, a famous story of nationalization, a kind of triumphant story of nationalization. Norway, often held up as a kind of darling of the global industry, right? Like, socialist democracy, uses the oil money in this fund and then pays out the fund to blah, blah, blah. Both of those industries have been ravaged by what has become newly possible with offshore technology, right? It's referred to as offshore technology, but it's like, again, using these ideas like the market logic of the offshore or the much more difficult technology of offshore oil. These companies, the Halliburtons, the Bechtels, the ExxonMobils of the world in various ways have completely undone those kinds of national projects. So there's a fabulous book called Paying for the Piper. It's about the Piper Alpha disaster in the North Sea, which happened, I want to say, sometime in the 80s. It's by Wolfson et al. It has a bunch of authors on it. And it's the North Sea, Norway. So it's precisely about how the offshore, little by little, ate away at the kinds of worker protections that made Norway's industry so exemplary and caused this particular kind of disaster, and behind it all of these different like kinds of worker whatever, like underpaid workers, unhappy workers, workers no longer with the kinds of protections that they had before, so none of those families were reimbursed, you know, kind of nightmare story. Mexico, similarly, I mean, Venezuela, right? Chavez fired 20,000 workers who tried to unionize. What an ironic story, right? But it is to say that the offshore in particular, and I do write about this at length in the book, has enabled certain kinds of practices that had kind of lost their luster onshore, that had become unacceptable onshore, but become newly acceptable, again, offshore.
So let me ask one brief follow-up question. I know you,
We're just looking at the clock here.
Tiffany's had her hand up the entire time, and I didn't see her, so.
Okay.
It's okay, if there's a follow-up, it's fine.
Sort of.
Okay, well, so you had so many points of interest that I was like, I want to latch onto this, but I'm going to put out two things that in my mind, they make sense together, but they may actually sound like separate questions. But, so you had a moment in question and answer, actually, where you brought up corporate social responsibility position, and then again, right? And in my former work in Western Australia, the notion of the corporate social responsibility position and ideal initiative within these oil and other extractive industries was starting to emerge, right? And so what ends up happening, at least in that context, was that these oil companies are actually becoming involved in nationalist politics around, in that specific context, around reconciliation between Indigenous Australians and white and settler Australians, right? And there was this really strange space emerging where race had to be implicated in the conversations about the labor structure because of the ways that people were encroaching on land. But again, these on-land things that you just mentioned, right, are we're seeing that they're different than what's permissible offshore. And so that question around corporate social responsibility was really fascinating to me. And I think tacks interestingly onto what you closed on in your conclusion about like our responsibilities and our capacity to serve as activists in particular kinds of spaces and not in others, and what that looks like. And so I think the overall sort of question is a methodological and maybe an interpretive one for you about choices that were made around what you do when you do not report, around choices to use pseudonyms and maintain anonymity for companies, right? You know, not just individuals but for companies, and that kind of space. And how do we really, how do we insert ourselves in ways that are useful while also acknowledging our need to participate in these sort of socially responsible things that capitalism produces?
Okay, so I'll start with the end, with the final, kind of your methodological point. So I do my best to, I mean, I always use pseudonyms. I often change genders of people, and I think the people I knew in the room who are familiar with Equatorial Guinea left. Is there anybody else who's been to Equatorial Guinea here? Who's spent any time there? But anybody who's spent any time in Equatorial Guinea would know who I was talking about. They would know which companies were which, even though I use corporate pseudonyms. And I remember talking to William Mozzarella about this in his book Shoveling Smoke, which is a sort of in-depth ethnography of a large advertising company in India, and he uses a pseudonym, and he's like, anybody sort of at all familiar with the Indian landscape at this particular moment in time, he's like, they would know who I had worked for. So my IRB agreement and the thing that I brought with me to the field said that unless I was explicitly directed otherwise, that I would always anonymize and use pseudonyms for corporations. And I, at that point, kind of felt mixed about that, and now feel happy about that because it allowed me to get in. You know, I think that oil companies are so used to being demonized and being vilified, and in the Equatorial Guinean government is another great example of a group of people who are really used to being demonized and vilified. If you haven't heard of Equatorial Guinea, then you just haven't heard of it. If you have heard of it, you've probably heard that they're like cannibals and the most corrupt country in the world, and like all, you know, and so in that particular meeting of these oil companies and that state apparatus, I mean, they just kick people out, right? People don't go to Equatorial Guinea. The oil industry opened that up because then people with US passports didn't need visas. So I was able to get in, and I was like, look, I'm gonna be here for a year, I can work for you for free, and I'm not gonna, I'll anonymize, and we can work on the pseudonyms and the company pseudonyms together, and people were okay with that eventually. And so I, just like, oh, you have to remind me of your first name, I'm sorry. Doug. Just like Doug said in the beginning, right? Anthropologists, and I saw Greg nodding vigorously along, we haven't been as good at like unpacking capitalism itself ethnographically and capitalist practices, and part of those are issues of access, obviously, and precisely the methodological issues to which you point. And so I do think that what can feel like very profound ethical violations, perhaps, are well worth it to try to figure out what the fuck is going on in our various ways. So in that way, I feel comfortable with those particular choices. It's also, this world is not like the particular activist venue that I've chosen, in part because I'm not Equato-Guinean. And so where I have chosen to intervene, it's been much more about whether it's about oil companies or whether it's about the financial arrangement that subtend stuff like this here in the US, which is where I'm based and which is where I feel much more ethically grounded. Now, could this book contribute to some of the other ongoing projects there? I certainly hope so. And I mean, I don't write about activists in Equatorial Guinea because activists in Equatorial Guinea spend a lot of time in jail, and they like don't need any help from me to spend more time there. So, like, did I have friends who were interested in, involved in interesting projects? Of course, but it's not what I chose for this book to be about, and it's not what it was about from the beginning. I knew I wanted to write about the companies themselves. So.
All right, thank you very much.